Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Tina VanDenburg, founder and owner of Kinship Handwork, which is for makers who crave a vibrant, fully lit up life. Tina grew up in a small town just north of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her sewing journey began when she couldn't find dresses that fit her body, a story that she'll share with us today. As her life evolved, she found that she wanted to teach women how to sew clothes they love so that they feel beautiful, empowered, and connected to both themselves and the world around them. Before finding this sense of empowerment, Tina spent her 20s following her curiosity, beginning with 3 years in Alaska and several years building houses as a carpenter back in Michigan. At 25, she opened a brick-and-mortar bookstore and art gallery, and it was here that her relationship with her body changed and her passion for sewing clothing began. Tina now offers online courses and retreats through her Kinship Handwork business. She blogs and has a vibrant podcast called In Kinship. She's involved in myriad activities and lives in Petoskey, Michigan with her young son, Ellis. Hello, Tina, and welcome to So-and-So.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. Meg, I'm excited to be here.
We are happy to have you. What a life. My goodness. You have checked a lot of boxes. And we're going to talk about many of those today. Some sewing, your history before that is fascinating. But I want to check this box first. How did you learn how to sew?
Oh, I've been thinking about that question, and I think probably through osmosis, quite honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I've been an intrepid, I can do this, independent little toddler, as you can imagine, my entire life. Not a toddler my whole life, but independent from early age. And I don't recall anyone teaching me how to sew, but I had a grandmother who sewed a lot, and I certainly watched to some degree. I just remember thinking, how hard can this be?
Mm-hmm.
And picking up the manual and getting started. But I didn't start on the sewing machine until I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned your grandmother, and you talk about not taking the time to learn from her, and then it was too late. Would you share this with us?
Yeah. My grandma was a seamstress. She made all the family's bridesmaids' dresses and wedding dresses. Probably she made other people's as well, but those are the people that I knew. She also made us as children all sorts of doll clothes. And I don't know if you remember, like she knitted and crocheted and did all of the making of all sorts of textile things.
Mm-hmm.
But she would crochet us those slippers. I don't know if you remember the slippers like from the 70s and 80s that were crocheted. And then she would take old jeans and cut soles out of them. And so they would be these crazy acrylic yarn, multiple probably rainbow colors with like denim bottoms on them. So those are some of my favorite memories as gifts from my grandma. And then when I became a high schooler, she would make my formal dresses. So she would come and visit, and we would go to I don't know what it was at the time. It wasn't Joanne Fabrics, but the equivalent in my town. And we would sit down and look through all these big pattern books. And she would tell me to pick out the dress I wanted. And then I would pick out the fabric I wanted. I remember one time I chose an upholstery fabric for this sheath dress. And she was such a magic maker that she could just make it all happen. And this is way before I understood that you need to, pretty closely match your pattern with your fabric. And so she made all of these formal dresses for me. And then my senior year in high school, she was making my homecoming dress. And I can distinctly remember her with pins in her mouth, which of course we all know you're not supposed to do.
Indeed.
In fact, quick little side story. I had a student tell me that they did that, or maybe it was a friend. No, this is one of those stories that maybe it's an urban myth. I'm not sure. But they did that and they inhaled one of the pins and it punctured their lungs. And I thought, that's almost made me stop doing it. It at least makes me think about it from time to time.
That's kind of an I told you so moment.
It is. I remember my grandmother with her pins in her mouth, and the cat would always lay on top of the sewing pattern. And she was pinning the dress to me, and I was impatient to get moving on to hanging out with my friends or something exciting when I was 17. And her saying, "You ought to learn how to sew for me because I'm not going to be around forever." And I didn't. And she wasn't. She ended up getting into a car accident that same year. And I never learned to sew from her. But in my late 20s, when I picked up garment sewing, I felt like I was channeling her at the sewing machine. I felt like in some ways she's with me whenever I sit down to sew something. And she comes to mind from time to time. And it's just this beautiful connection to a grandmother whom I love very much, but didn't get to see all that often.
So in ways, she is there teaching you how to sew.
Yeah. Yes.
That's special, and it's nice to have that feeling in the room with you. Now you mentioned Tina in your 20s, and in the introduction, I mentioned that you had spent 3 years in Alaska. What did you do up there?
Ah. Well, I this is a story, I guess. Well, let me answer the quick answer. I am one of those humans who like spins around on the idea. I worked in the tourism industry. So I went up and I worked in Denali National Park in a hotel for 2 seasons. And then I worked in Hatcher Pass, which is down near Anchorage. And then I also worked for a sea kayaking company in Seward, Alaska. But I got to Alaska because right out of school, I went to college and I had no idea what it was that I wanted to do. And nobody told me that I didn't have to pick something that I was going to then be stuck with forever, because that's certainly how it felt to me. I had to pick this one thing when I had barely lived, right? I had to
Mm-hmm.
pick this one thing that was going to be the thing I did for the rest of my life. And that very idea felt very shackling to me. And so I went to school for a semester, and then I started working at this auto parts factory as a customer service rep. And what that meant was, and this is the late 90s. So I
Mm-hmm.
had a pretty heady job with them. I was 19 and 20 years old, and I had a bag phone in my car.
Ooh. Mhm.
I had a laptop with a portable modem, and I had to keep track of stock for places like Ford Motor Company all the time. So I was on call 24 hours a day. And I got to the point where I was making great money, and I had a lot of responsibility, which felt really amazing, especially since I had decided to leave college because I didn't know what I wanted to do. So this felt like a step of I'm still a worthy human in some way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I got to the point, though, where I would walk out of birthday parties. I never could stay at the movies long enough to watch the movie. And I thought, we're not saving lives here. We're talking about door handles to cars, right? And I thought there has to be more to life than this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there would be a mandatory shutdown after Christmas. And that Christmas, when I was 20 years old, I was looking online. This is like back when you had to dial up and use your phone line.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking online because I had a passion for hiking and backpacking and camping, and I wanted to go somewhere and do some real backpacking. My family were campers, but we had never really backpacked before. And I just thought, I'm 20 years old. I want to go do something really exciting. And as I was looking, I found a site that talked about Denali National Park. And I'm like, I was just thinking of vacation. I was like, I'm going to go to Denali National Park on vacation on my own. And then the next thing I know, sort of following this trust and intuition, and I can't even tell you how or why this happened, I stumbled upon a job for a night auditor and an accountant. And I applied for Denali National Park for a hotel outside of it and was granted the job. And so I went from making quite a bit of money for a 19, 20-year-old back in the late 90s to making minimum wage in Alaska. And
Mm-hmm.
I quit my job and I moved to Alaska.
And you stayed there for 3 years.
I did.
So it
I
must have
loved
worked.
it. It did. And I learned more about myself And my perception and vision of the world opened so intensely in Alaska in a way that it wouldn't have, I don't believe, had I stayed in my small town in Michigan. I saw people that were doing things I had never done. I saw people who looked like I did not look. You know, I had grown up in a northern town that was primarily white. I saw a variety of people in Alaska, which might sound strange, but is the case. And I really attribute that trip to Alaska to opening my mind and changing the trajectory of my life.
Why did you come back to Michigan?
Family. I really missed my family. Have a brother, and he had just had my first nephew, not him, his wife had, but the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt really excluded from their lives. And I told anybody who would listen, if I were an orphan, I would have lived in Alaska my whole life because I loved the freedom I felt there, and I loved sort of the sense of wildness that I experienced. And I love nature, so it was a great fit for me on so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
But I missed my family,
Mm-hmm.
and so I came back.
And then when you came back, you opened a brick and mortar bookstore, an art gallery, and you talk about, and I'm going to quote you here, starting before you knew what you were doing and being curious and adventurous, and it changed your relationship with your body and your sense of self. That's a lot. Can you share that with us? Unpack that a little bit?
I can, I can. So I was 25 when I opened the bookstore, and it was another one of those life decisions where I was working as a carpenter at the time because I came back from Alaska and knew that I did not want to repeat my experience with working customer service for this tier one automotive supplier. I knew that I wanted more to my life than that. So I was working as a carpenter until I figured out what my next steps were. And I was driving through this small town that I grew up in, and I see this building for rent. And I thought that would make an amazing bookstore. And I keep driving, and there's this little niggling voice inside my body that said, go back and call on it. And I'm like, what?
Oh, it's those voices, right?
It is.
They'll get you every time.
They will. And so I did. I went back, and it's sort of the same voice that was like, what if you moved to Alaska and got a job there instead of vacationing? Right. And I went back and I called on this building. And the next thing I knew, I was opening a bookstore, which was another way that my life opened. I met so many interesting people that lived a different kind of walk of life than what I had grown up in. And I remember at the time, I wore a lot of baggy t-shirts and a lot of hiking pants. And
Mm-hmm.
all of them were ill-fitting. And there were so many ways in which I was dynamic and outgoing and independent. But my physical appearance, I felt very frumpy. I felt frumpy and I felt sort of invisible. And I was sort of surprised people could actually see me,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And one day I go to my mailbox and there's a catalog for, I wasn't a plus size person per se at that time, but I was somewhere near the edge of that. And I got a catalog in the mail for, I think it was Lane Bryant. And I'm looking through it, and there are these beautiful women in here who are dressed in clothing that actually fits their body, or at least the perception of, of that in the magazine. And I had never really paid attention to such a thing or saw a body that looked more closely related to mine that I found so attractive. And so that started this sort of opening the door of wanting to wear something different on my body, wanting to feel a different way, and understanding that what you wear impacts how you feel. What
Mm-hmm.
you wear impacts how you present yourself to the world, impacts how you walk through the world. And so I started to try to find clothing that more fit what I liked or who I wanted to feel like, and not this sort of hiding behind baggy clothing person.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a thrift store one day, and in the thrift store, I find this mint green polyester dress that's handmade. And it's a pretty little green. I pick it up and I try it on and it fits my body perfectly. And I am shocked because at the time I thought I had this strange body that did not fit into clothing that I would find on the rack, right? I am rather large breasted, had a relatively small waist and wider hips. And so finding a dress that fit me was nearly impossible. And at the time I was unique in that. Having taught people how to sew clothing now for almost a decade, I understand that almost everyone has a challenging relationship with their body and thinks that they're weird, that their arms are too long or their torso is too short, or they struggle to find clothing that fits because their waist is actually a little bit thicker than their hips, right? Like I have come to understand that I was not unique in that is just the way it is because the clothing that we find on the shelf, the clothing that we sew straight from a sewing pattern, they're designed for this average body, which is actually nobody, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so it creates this dissonance and this feeling of unworthiness, which I think is really tragic. And so for me to find this dress that fits me so perfectly, I was elated. And it was handmade, which put it into my mind that if somebody made this dress, I could probably make this dress.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took it home because there were a couple of things wrong with it. One is it was a old polyester material, like the kind, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's like a 60s or 70s polyester, the kind that really traps in the body and immediately makes you rather pungent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it had that smell. Although I will say, uh, rest my poor grandmother's soul here. It smelled a bit like my grandma used to because she wore a lot of
Oh.
polyester shirts. So it did have a little nostalgia to it
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in a way. And it also was this pretty mint green that, while pretty, did not really do anything for my face. It made me feel very washed out when I actually wore it. But the fit was amazing. And so I got out some newspaper. I put that dress down on the newspaper. I traced around it. I found this really beautiful quilting cotton. And let me back up and mention, if I didn't before, that polyester dress was a knit dress. So I had my quilting cotton. This is my first dress ever, my first piece of clothing ever. And I make a pattern because I had seen patterns before, right? So I had some idea of how that worked. I didn't really pay attention to my grandmother, but in some ways I saw it happening around me. And I sewed it up out of the quilting cotton. And if you know anything about fabric, which I'm assuming you do if you're listening to this
Mm-hmm.
podcast, you know that quilting cotton and knits are not interchangeable. But I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a dress that had no fasteners, had no buttons, it had no zippers because the original dress did not. The original dress was just pull over your head, knit fabric. And so I was able to get this dress onto my body, but like one body part at a time. You probably know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And it just barely fits. Like it was forgiving enough because it was an A-line fit and flare kind of a dress. It was forgiving enough in the hip that was no problem. And it was really quite snug in the waist and quite snug at the bust, but I could get it on. I mean, I couldn't do a lot of eating or a lot of breathing while I had the dress on, but it made me so happy to have made it with my own two hands and to have something that fit my body. And it began this, I'm trying to do the math here, 17 or 18-year journey rather, of learning about fabric, learning about fit, fine tuning what I wear, and making almost all of my own clothing at this point because I like things to fit in a very particular way. And now that I have the skill to do that, it's really hard for me to buy anything off the rack because I feel dissatisfied with how it fits at the waist or how short the sleeves are or
Mm-hmm.
any number of things. And that dress though was the gateway to this love affair with sewing clothing.
Do you still have that dress?
I do not. I know it's sort of tragic. I have a photo of that dress,
Okay.
which I'll share with you.
Share that with us for the website.
I'll do that.
Because we'd love to see that your gateway dress.
It was a gateway dress. I will do that. And I had a women's group that night that I made it, and I wore it to that I wore it to that women's group, and I just like flew in like a little peacock, right? I was like, I made this dress. I mean, and of course, none of them have any idea that how tight it is, so they're like, that's amazing. Um, yeah, I have the picture. I don't have the dress.
Look forward to that. Um,
Yeah.
Tina, you live with the belief that we can take our lives into our own hands, not only our clothing, as you were talking about, but the whole experience. Um, Tell us about that.
Oh. So, as an independent do-it-yourselfer, and I'm guessing that your audience relates to this very deeply. I love to take and sort of disconnect from what I am told I should wear or should do, and understand that I have the ability to create the life that I want with my own two hands. And that began with like material things, right? That began with I can decide what kind of curtains I want to have in my home. I don't have to choose just from what's available to me at the store. I can decide, and this sort of became a rally cry, if you will, for independence and self sustainability. And don't tell me what to do, sort of an energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and it moved on to food. I could decide what I canned and what I foraged and what I put into my body. And I didn't have to worry about there being some hidden ingredient that I didn't understand or some false advertising around it. And also, there was the empowerment that came from I could survive on my own in some ways with the skills and knowledge that I currently have, right? And the first time I experienced that feeling was in Alaska, my very first time backpacking. I remember taking off the backpack, bringing out the tent and all of the accoutrements and feeding myself, obviously, with food that I brought with me. I know this is a little flawed, but I remember after that first night, and I was on the side of the mountain thinking, I could survive on my own in the wilderness. I had the skills to do that. And again, that's not exactly true, but it's that sense of capability that has led a lot of my making in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to empower that and bring that to the forefront for people in all different ways. So then as I've aged, it's moved somewhat to include, not from, but to include emotional aspects as well. So I believe that we have the responsibility and we have the ability, if you will, to experience our lives however we want to experience them. We can't really dictate whatever circumstances are going to come into our lives. We can't decide what's going to actually happen to us per se. We can try to align ourselves with this or align ourselves with that. But we always have a choice on how we experience what's happening in our lives and how we experience, just how we experience what's happening in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the podcast that I have, we often will explore ways in which people will put into practice um, the things that bring them joy. So, like, I think of it as, for example, I know that if I meditate every morning, I am going to have a much better chance of having an ease filled, joy filled day. I also know that if I make sure that I see friends at least like once a week, right? Or and I know that if I make things with my own two hands, whatever that is, on a regular basis, and I know that if I walk almost every day, those four things are going to set me up to feel more grounded and more capable to handle the ebbs and flows of my life than if I don't do them. And those things are in my control.
Mm-hmm.
I can make space for those things. And so on the podcast, I like to explore what ways are other makers setting themselves up for success and also learning to trust that little voice, right? That allows them to follow a path of joy rather than, oh, I can't do that. This is impossible.
So there's so much in that with just the self empowerment, talking about how others are doing this, and I have this list, Tina, of all the stuff that you do, and before I even ask this question, I think you synthesized this for us, but I just want to make sure I get this list out there, and then we're going to kind of circle back on this. Besides being a sewist, you are a home builder, food preserver, forager, natural dyer, budding gardener, watercolor painter, knitter and crocheter, teacher, student, and I love this. You call yourself a mama to one wee fella. Um, and I'm sure Ellis is a powerhouse in your life. All of these just seem to come together under that umbrella of empowerment and living your life as you want to and taking charge. Am I on the right path with this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My artistry, my creativity has um, falls under the umbrella of beauty and utility. Right? I
Mm-hmm.
love to create things that have utility. That doesn't mean I don't love art that other people create for the sake of art, because I do. And sometimes when I dabble with watercolor, um, and that's just a dabbling, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
I I am creating something just for the beauty of it, and that there's I'm not disparaging that at all. But what really cranks me up, what really lights me up, if you will, is to create things that I then can use that have a utility in my life. So if I could hand carve a spoon, that would feel amazing, right? It's got this, which I have a few hand carved spoons. They're not beautiful, but I have, because it's something that I'm going to use. It's going to be part of my everyday life. It's something that I have created. And so it kind of hits both those marks. So you're absolutely right. And that the things that I love to do all fall under like sort of the building blocks, if you will, of life.
Mm-hmm.
Things like
Mm-hmm.
food, shelter, clothing, connection.
Mm-hmm. And then you started a business, and you say you wanted to gather with women in handiwork. And I want to know that. And you also say you want to help people live a fully lit up life. What is that?
Well, it's exactly um, that idea of we have more control over how we experience life. And that if we are brave enough to do the things in our life, make space in our lives for the things that are important to us, the things that help us to feel grounded, the things that help us to feel powerful, the things that help us to feel creative, that will show up in life more fully lit up.
Mm-hmm.
And so lit up is, that person that's got a sparkle in their eye. It's when I wore that brand new dress that was so ill-fitting that I only wore a couple times because it was very uncomfortable, to that women's gathering, right? It's that feeling of curiosity and joy of life. And I want to experience that and share that with other people, and women in
Mm-hmm.
particular, because when I started my business in my 30s, we always are starting or doing something that is related to where we are in life, right? I was feeling fairly disconnected from feminine influence in my life.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of my bookstore, but before I closed it, I had joined this yurt building workshop, and it
Yurt
was,
building.
yeah, it was a wooden tapered wall yurt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was a 2-week long thing. And you came and you stayed on this property. And it was one of my clients who had come to the bookstore. She had invited me to be part of this. And so we built this yurt by hand under the tutelage of William Copperthwaite, which he has a book out that's just a beautiful book. He has since passed on. But we were all there. It was like the most beautiful experience I have ever had. So we're building this yurt by hand. We're talking. It felt like a very quilting bee kind of energy to it, right? At one point, we're all on the roof shaping cedar shakes for the roof, and we're working in pairs because he had really fine-tuned this down to be, what is the way to have the best connection with other humans, and how can we work with our hands to create something of utility and beauty, right? And so at one point, there are groups of two, like I think there were 14 of us or so, all around the roof line of this yurt, bantering back and forth, working with our hands. And it was the most magical experience. And this was in my late 20s. In my 30s, I was craving more of that. I was craving sort of that, I was craving feminine influence in my life, and I was craving connection. And so I started a business doing retreats. Now they're on Mackinac Island, but at the time I was working to have them in different locations where I could bring together my love of handcrafting, handmaking, and that would end up being in the form of clothing because that's where my mastery is as far as handwork goes. And I wanted to bring us together and have that connection and have that mindfulness and then intentionality in our lives, which were the words I was using early on to talk about living a fully lit up life, right? To
Mm-hmm.
talk about taking on responsibility for our own joy. And so that's how Kinship Handwork began. It began with retreats. And then now I've got some online courses and I do some workshops, both online and in person. Um, Ultimately, I have settled into, I absolutely love to teach. I love to be there and help somebody along that path to remember that they are capable.
Maybe sometimes even to learn in the first place that they're
Yeah.
capable.
Yes.
Now, you talk about the sense of community. And when you were talking about that experience in building, it's like we were there with you, sitting in that circle and experiencing with you. And that sense of community, Tina, is so incredibly powerful. Talk about this and, gathering with others, doing the work that sustains the basics of life, food, clothing, and shelter. And not only do you feel powerful, but what sense do you get when you know that you have shared that with somebody else?
I feel expansive. I feel like, sort of like in this conversation or the conversations that you have with your guests on your podcast and that I have with my guests on my podcast, like when we get to share stories with one another, when we get to have the ability to see other humans and remember that one, we're not alone, and two, other people, more people than we probably know, can relate to what we have going on in our lives.
Hmm.
And so there's this beautiful warmth that sort of emanates out of us, I think, when we are in community and when we are in connection. I have these retreats that I do on Mackinac Island, and there's always somebody who's a little bit apprehensive to jump right into the fray, right? Because in my retreats, I do a whole mindfulness aspect to it as well. So we'll begin with a morning circle where we talk about feelings and emotions and all these things that are so like lovely. And then we get into the sewing, and then we end our day by doing something called the Koya dance, which is like sort of this dance, stretch, yoga, intentional movement kind of thing. And I love watching somebody be nervous. I don't love watching them be nervous, but I love watching them be nervous and push through and join in and then feel such a sense of belonging after having been vulnerable.
Hmm.
And I want that. I want more of that for all of us.
So, Tina, there's a lot that you get in the moment from working with the people in your retreats. Overall, what inspires you?
Hmm. I am inspired by authenticity. I am inspired by people who speak their minds and
Hmm.
who are brave and able. Not that they're not afraid, because I think that bravery is really, um, bravery and fear go hand in hand.
Hmm.
But people who live and express themselves as authentically as they can, because that very act is palpable. Like we can see that. We don't understand exactly what we're seeing, but we can feel somebody's authenticity and somebody's vulnerability. And so just humans who are authentic have always inspired me. And then when you get somebody who's also an artist or a maker in some way, like I can remember distinctly, I went to this concert once ages ago, and it was just at like it was at a local venue. It was like 100 people there, maybe. And this woman got up, and I can't tell you what she sang. I can't even tell you exactly what she played, I don't think. Maybe a guitar. But her rawness and her vulnerability like brought tears to my eyes.
Hmm.
Because I thought the bravery in that, right? Because we all have things like I have secret aspirations. This is breaking news here on your
Okay, breaking news. I love it.
I have secret aspirations to being a singer, right? I don't have a great singing voice. I've never studied music, but in the shower, I'm playing some kind of an instrument and I'm singing, or in the car, especially in the car. And I imagine myself on stage and I can see all of this. And I don't actually imagine this is ever going to happen, but it has been a very fearful thing for me, even though I'm brave in so many other ways. It's been a very fearful thing for me to sing in front of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially to see this woman get up there, and she had a beautiful voice, but like her rawness and her vulnerability, where you could feel them. And so it's that expression that I find so inspirational. And that doesn't have to just be, music. That could be the way somebody does anything.
There is no doubt that we will hear you sing sometime in the near future. That we will add that to your list. Tina, you talked about your podcast just in passing before, and I want to circle back to that for a minute. Tell us about your podcast and maybe some of your more interesting conversations, and let's share how people can find it so they can learn more.
Okay. A year ago, I started a podcast called In Kinship. It's a podcast for makers who crave a vibrant life on their own terms. And I was craving a venue. So I love to teach, right? I love to teach clothing, sewing. I love to teach people how to hack the pattern into their own styles. I love to show people how to take it on themselves, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I absolutely adore that. But I don't always get to talk about all of the mindfulness, intentionality stuff when I'm teaching like a workshop, as an example. Although I sneak a bit in, as you might imagine.
Oh, sure.
But I was missing out on some conversations that I wanted to have that were more based in connection. And so I started my podcast, and I'm talking to makers primarily because it's fun to talk to makers. And I love to make things. But really, we're talking about how they're living their lives or what they're putting into their lives as ways to bring more joy into their life, to live more vibrantly. And so it might be their practices that they do. Like for somebody that might be running every morning, or that might be playing the guitar, or it might be any number of things, right? The things that they make non-negotiable in their lives so that they have a base of joy is kind of my thought. And then also, like, I like to explore those ideas, those things that are just like little ideas, like turning back to call on that building and opening the bookstore, which was like one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And like, but so many people have those same kind of experiences. They had like, I don't know why I did this, but I did it. And look, and this amazing thing happened afterwards. I had no idea it would, So I love to explore that too, to remind us to be open to sort of the magic of the universe, or to trust, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of my favorite, so that's why I started the podcast. Some of my favorite episodes that come to mind right this minute is I spoke with Kitty Wilkin from Night Quilter last spring. And I had met Kitty at a retreat in Maine, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And she and I really hit it off. We both are hard of hearing, and we both wear hearing aids. And she was the first person that I met who was more my age, who had the same hearing loss that I did. And I felt so seen by her, because this was before I got my hearing aids. And she really gave me a hand up in feeling more comfortable with my own, well, like asking for what I needed, asking for someone to speak up or to look me in the face when they talk to me, things like that. And so I was excited to have her on the podcast, and that did not disappoint. And she talked about how she works on quilting her life, and how using this connection to quilting, this sort of like gamification of quilting, if you will, she infuses all these wonderful experiences that she wants to experience into her life. So I don't know if this is making sense, but what she'll do is she'll put out a goal for herself for the summer, as an example, and say, like, she had a pleasure quilt one year. And so she had a list of all the things that brought her pleasure. So every time she achieved whatever that criteria was, she got to do a block in her quilt.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm not a quilter, and I'm probably never going to be a quilter, but I just found this so fascinating. And then I also am thinking of the conversation I had with Roxanne Camper, who teaches drafting classes online. I don't know if drafting class is exactly how she would say this, but what I loved about her conversation with me is that we are really similar in a lot of ways and absolute opposite in others. I'm a fast mover, right? Like this is how I have so many things that I do in my life is I'm moving quickly and I'm craving a slowing down. And she's a slow mover and she comes at it from a really sort of slower pace. And in some ways, the two of us come together and now we've become friends and we have conversations on the regular and this beauty of what we can share with one another. Right? But I love how she shares this idea of looking at your artistry, looking at your craft as more of a practice and less of an end result.
Mm-hmm.
And so that conversation was beautiful.
And she has been a guest on this podcast.
She's amazing.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, she is. She's got a fun story for sure. I also love the conversation that I had with Eliza Wheeler, who's an illustrator and author. These all have a connection to me. And I love then how we bring that connection into the podcast and then how I hope that my listeners feel a connection to it as well. But I have recently divorced. So in the last 2 years, I've divorced. And before then, I was in a really rough space. And I ended up being in a bookstore with my little boy. And I see this book called Home in the Woods. And it's just beautiful. And my little boy's got no interest in it whatsoever. He's like, he wants like fighting dinosaurs or something, right? He
of
does
course
not.
He does.
Right. He does not want a book that's got like a log cabin on the front. I don't remember exactly what the front is, but it looked very homey and beautiful. And I pick it up, and it's a story of her grandmother's existence. And her grandmother was a little girl. When her grandmother was a little girl, her dad passed away and left something like 7 or 8 children. And it was right around the Great Depression, and they had just lost their home. And so the mother and all these children end up finding a shack in the woods. Actually, I think the dad might have found it. He passed away from cancer, but he might have found it beforehand. I'm trying to do it justice here. But ultimately, the idea is that this mother and these 7 children live in this little shack and they make it into a home. And at the time of my life, when I found it, and it's beautifully illustrated, it's just gorgeous. At the time in my life that I found it, I thought, if this woman can live in a little shack in the woods with her 7 children, and they can all live to be happy, loving adults, I'm assuming, then I'm going to be okay too. And so I had this wonderful conversation with Eliza about her book and about her creative process and about some vulnerability that she had while creating this story. And it was just everything I could have hoped for.
And your podcast is called In Kinship.
Yes. And you can find it anywhere that you listen to podcasts.
That and it sounds like many of your episodes are so worth the time to sit down and enjoy those. And that book you mentioned is A Home in the Woods.
Yes, by Eliza Wheeler.
Tina, what's your dream?
That's a big question. I had a very clear answer to that a couple of years ago. And then these couple of years have really shifted. Have really shifted the ground underneath me. I guess I mentioned that I divorced.
Mm-hmm.
I also had an autoimmune disorder last year that kept me homebound and unable to dress myself or wash my hair. I was unable to do any of the making that I had done for a very long time. And I am recovering from that. And I'm to the point now where I can do pretty much everything I could do beforehand, which feels amazing. And I shared before we started the podcast that I just bought 2 acres and I put this little house on wheels on these 2 acres to live on. And it's been a whirlwind couple of years, and I'm just starting to settle back into life and imagine what my next steps are going to be. And I can feel the magic building around it. I can feel a sense of grounding happening. And I think that it's going to always include connecting, particularly with other women. And it's always going to include teaching because I enjoy empowering other people to take their lives into their own hands. In the short term, it's going to include a couple of retreats next year. It's going to include some online virtual workshops. I have a new sewing studio that I have not really gotten to use yet. So I'm so excited for that to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, my dream is to live as fully awake as I can with a sense of ease and a sense of joy, no matter what's happening.
There's that fully lit up life.
Yeah.
In everything we talked about today, Tina, and there has been a lot you've shared with us, and I'm grateful for that. Is there any question I didn't ask you wish I had?
I don't think so. I know I can go off on tangents, so hopefully that has had some good coherence to it in the end.
It's been wonderful. And there's just so much for us to unpack and think about. And this has just been great. I want to thank you so much for sharing your stories. And there's just so much abundance in what you've done. Um, the people sharing this with us would like to reach out to you. What's the best way for them to do that?
Well, on my on my website, it's probably the best way to get all the information. I have a newsletter that I send out on a regular basis. And that's where you can find the podcast and you can find out about anything that I'm doing. It's kinshiphandwork.com.
And I'd love for people to tell you when they do reach out that they heard you on this podcast.
That would be amazing.
Tina, thank you so much for joining us today. And we appreciate your time and conversation.
Thank you so much, Meg. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you. Someone for whom sewing is so much more than a hobby. It leads into a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or just complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.